The next verse is, "This he, Jesus, said to show by what kind of death he, Peter, was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, 'Follow me.'" The suffering, the trials that we're going to experience through feeding or through infirmity, old age, those are trials through which we can glorify God. God is not shocked, surprised, stunned by what needs to happen, sort of these trials. So I'll use an example. In boats. Trials there. In my mid-college, I took a year out trying to make a national team for rowing. I was back in Seattle. I was rowing a lot. I had an internship, and I was biking from the boathouse to my job. And I had a brief moment of flight as I orbited my bicycle and then landed in the pavement. And I broke my jaw in 2 places. And it hurt a lot. They needed to do, I had to go to the ER. They needed to run some tests, or they thought they might need to run some tests. So it was several hours of lying in a bed. They couldn't give me painkillers for some reason. So I was just sitting there. It was not enjoyable. It was very unpleasant. But I've got in my pain catalog that I can look through, I had a lot of rowing, a lot of trials and testing of row 2,000 meters as fast as you can. And I can look at that in close proximity to breaking my jaw. And the trials and testing of rowing was much than my whole jaw experience. Testing is hard. It's painful. It's not fun. Testing was hard. It was painful. It was not fun. But there was something exciting about it too. There was something that was energizing about the idea of, okay, I have a test tomorrow. I knew it was going to hurt like mad, but there was something exciting because there was glory coming. Fear of testing in rowing showed 3 things. 1, a lack of faith. A lack of faith in my physical capability or my ability to do what I needed to do in my performance. An over-prioritization of my comfort. A test is not a comfortable experience. It hurts. And if I'm prioritizing my comfort heavily, then that's going to be something where I fear or dislike the testing. And then finally, a deprioritization. Guy to do the test, you're all lined up and somebody finishes first. That's fun. There's glory in that. And to be afraid of the testing showed those 3 things. Some amount of lack of faith in my ability. I'm not ready for this. I'm not strong enough. I'm not going to perform well. Over prioritization of comfort and deprioritization of glory. It's just going to hurt. I don't actually want it. Winning is not that important to me. Okay, we're talking about rowing. Ultimately, not hugely meaningful in the scheme of life. But when it comes to actual trials, in our lives, when it comes to responding to God's call, I think those same things apply. We are very fortunate that our response to trials is not dependent on abilities, our preparation. It's dependent on God's ability. Be afraid of trials from the standpoint of I'm not strong enough. God is. As Patrick led us in singing, God is the greatest power. We shall never be defeated. Rely on my strength. We can rely on God's. So that's the first one. And then prioritization of comfort and deprioritization of glory. This is much harder. I'm going to go to James. Actually, I'll read for you. James chapter 1, verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And then 2 Chronicles 32, verse 31. This is relating to Hezekiah. And so in the matter of the who had been sent to him, Hezekiah, to inquire about the sign that had been done in the land, God left him to himself in order to test him and to know all that was in his heart. God does not tempt. God will test us. That is something that we will experience in our lives. So as we deal with that, we don't have to fear from the faith standpoint. We know God is able to handle all of this. From the standpoint of comfort and glory, we need to not prioritize our comfort over God's glory. And that's hard when we're hurting. But let's think about who God is, truly. So we're going to spend just a short time thinking about this. Who is God? If God is who he says he is, His glory is a good thing. Have you guys ever worked either in your professional lives or in school on a joint project? And somebody did a good job. They did all the hard work, and the product is as good as it is because of the work that somebody else did. Doesn't mean that you didn't contribute, but somebody else is really the star. And did you ever, or somebody else say, hey, you get a good grade on it, you get a good. Actually, Susie's thing, they really did that. That's right to give that person the glory because they did the work, and they deserve it. And yeah, maybe it means that I get slightly less of the pie of reward, but it's good. How much more with God? The glory of God's creation that He's made, the intricacy of super small things, atoms, and then the hugeness of stars and the galaxy. James Webb Telescope photos came out, a month ago, several weeks ago. And you think about the God who designed that, who made it, who causes all the laws of physics to work together in our lives. Think of massive things, beautiful things, such wild things, animals, waterfalls, mountains. Make them out of nothing. The goodness of the gift and the fact about us, loves us, gave Himself. If that God really does exist, which He does, but if that God really does exist, then His glory actually is more important than my comfort. And when you add into that the fact that He loves us, He works all things together for our good. His plans for us are to benefit and prosper us. Then the trials and testings that are coming are not terrifying. They will be painful, they will be uncomfortable. But God is still good through that, and His glory is still what should be our priority. It's not easy. But is that how we actually think? And if not, if you say, ooh, yes, which is practically often my response when I'm in the middle of a trial, I tend to start thinking a whole lot about my comfort, how much this hurts. Response. Spend some time today thinking about who God is. There's a book A.W. Tozer wrote called The Knowledge of the Holy. Very, very good book that sort of walks through a dwelling on who is God. Let's think about God. So that is my challenge to you. Through this, how exciting to know that the words here aren't, this Jesus said to show Peter by what kind of death he was to die. But it's, this Jesus said to show Peter by what kind of death he was to glorify God. Death, there is glorification of God. John spoke several weeks ago on his passion with death. Not that we don't need to fear. That's it with trials. The next thing in this is obeying God's calling without comparison. For this, I'm going to have Zach join me on stage for a brief. So please turn in your Bibles or in your mobile devices these verses, and I want to look at verse 18, 19, and 20. So again, this Jesus said, and when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." And then 20, we'll go into that. Peter, turning around, saw the disciple. So for this, I will play Jesus, and Zach will play Peter. So it notes in verse 20 that they're walking, they're moving in some fashion. So we're going to walk a little bit, and I will say, "Follow me." Okay, thank you, Zach. That's our little skit. So this hokey skit is because I think this is actually a really I want you to remember this. Jesus just said, "Follow me." Literally the last two words written here are "follow me," and then the next two words are "Peter turned." This is not a hard thing. They're literally walking. Peter can just continue following him as well. But Peter stops, turns. I assume he stops because you can't really turn and walk at the same time. Wow, what a crazy thing. I think this is unbelievable. I think this is fairly accurate for often our responses, but Jesus just says, "Follow me," And then Peter turns around. Wow, guys, I think this is huge. Why did Peter turn around? Follow me. Verse 21. So Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back in his bosom at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? And Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? Was Peter comparing himself with John and saying, okay, so like I'm gonna die, but like what about this dude? How's he gonna die? Was that what it was? Was he seeking some sort of comfort and camaraderie with others? Okay, I'm gonna die, but like is John gonna be with me in that, or am I gonna be all on my own? Was it jealousy? Was it something as trivial as he didn't know John was following them and John tripped and made a noise and Peter was like, oh, well, yeah, well, what about him? I don't know why he turned. But I think it is what I'm going to call the fig leaf. You guys may recall from Genesis, one of the first things they did fig leaves. Throughout history, much of the story of the Bible is God being in intimate, close relationship with us. We sin, and we put something between us and God as some sort of protective barrier. It's too much to be too close right now. And God removes that and brings us back into relationship with him. God tearing the curtain in the temple and opening us up into the Holy of Holies as a recent example, or recent in where we are in John, example of this. But I think Peter's response here is what I'm going to call the fig leaf. The first item here is interacting with Jesus through others. These are two things that I see in this passage, but these are also the two fig leaves that are very common in my life. So interacting with Jesus through others. John, in writing this, describes the disciple, in verse 20, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back on his, who is the one who betrays you. That one of the reasons John is describing himself in that way is to bring us back to this time. So this is the verse where Peter asks that of John. It's during the Last Supper, John chapter 13, verses 21 through 25. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. This is John. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? I don't know this, but I believe that John points us back to this, and when he describes himself in this circumstance, where Peter says, well, Lord, what about this guy? Because I think he's pointing us that of interacting with Jesus through John when it was too much. Jesus, in this section here during the Last Supper, Jesus has finished washing the disciples' feet. They're together. They're in this period of closeness. Jesus has come into the city. It's a significant event for them. And then Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. Wow, yikes. That would be difficult. And Peter goes, hey, ask him who it is. I think that's part of it. This is too much for me to deal with. I can't interact directly with you, Jesus. So I need somebody else to do what I need with you. And I think here, there's been this huge moment of reconciliation between Peter and Jesus. And Peter tells him, Jesus tells Peter, feed my sheep, follow me. This is how you're going to die. I don't know if that was really for Peter specifically to know that he was going to die following Jesus. He had just betrayed him. So to hear like, hey, you're going to die following me might have been, almost too much relief to hear. I'm not going to betray him again. Finally, I will fully follow my God. Or if it was just a whole lot to deal with, I think he goes and tries to interact with Jesus through John. So that's one way we apply the fig leaf to protect ourselves from Jesus, interacting with Jesus through others. Do you guys have people that you put between yourself and Jesus when you're just too sensitive? It could be John. I need my pastor between me and Jesus. I can't have a direct relationship with Jesus in this. It could be family members. People that you say, I am having a really hard time right now. I can't pray to Jesus. to pray to Jesus for me? You know, are there people that you put between yourself and Jesus to shield you, to protect you? One of the things that I think is really cool here is the Bible says that Jesus intercedes with us, or for us, with God. That we do feel God is too holy for me to come approach him. And that's great because Jesus is there to intercede for you. And the great news is he's also God. So it's a pretty exciting, relieving thing that if you do feel that, I have to have something between me and God, Jesus has died to do that. That's pretty great. So one way, interacting with Jesus through others. Another way is hiding in our heads, getting very mental about an issue. In John chapter, woman at the well story, some of you guys may recall it, but a short section of it, Samaritan woman at the well, about living water, and really he means him. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." I think this is a really fascinating response. Later on, she goes and tells the people of her village, "Come meet this man who told me everything I've ever done in my life. Could this be the Messiah?" This is a very impactful event for her. And her response later on, fellow village people, she says, "Could this be the Messiah?" So it's not just, this thing. To go to a point of theology. Okay, answer me this question. Did Adam and Eve have a belly button or not? Okay, that's a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think this is something that we do. It's certainly something that I do. When I'm faced with Jesus, okay, I'm going to go make this mental right now. I have control of my brain. I can work this through, and I can think about this through my mind and not have to respond immediately to God's call. Rather than follow Jesus' command to follow him, I'm going to turn around and ask about something mental right now. This is something that I see in myself. I think that this is, one of the key fig leaves that we do. Instead of responding, what about this guy? And ask related to the actual obedience calling issue at hand. Do you see this in your lives? Do you see yourself say, okay, I'm going to start, getting into the theology of this. I know that God's told me to do this, but I'm going to get into the theology of this first. I'm really going to make sure that, I have this all mentally buttoned up and laid out. Maybe the best way to follow Jesus is just to obey him and do what he says. And not worry too much about, do I understand why? Do I see all of how this works together? So another reason not to respond to calling with comparison is that we're just not good at it. Jesus is telling a parable recounted in Luke of the tax collector and the Pharisee, all sort of a tax collector and a Pharisee. Tax collector, Pariah, of religious performance. And the Pharisee prays, God, I thank you, I'm not like other men, even like this tax collector. What a scrub. I do all these great religious things. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, Jesus speaking, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. We're not good at comparison. This is another reason not to respond to God's calling with comparison. We're just not good at it. If you think, okay, yeah, God's called me to do this, and I'm mostly doing it. I'm mostly obeying. I'm better than these other people. Probably comparison. Position, you're actually not the one being justified. So, to do something, just do it. Don't compare. Don't say, I'm not really responding to God's call, but I'm responding to God's call like pretty well for my society. That's not what God calls you to do. It's follow me. So God's grace is pretty cool in his response to Peter. Verse 22, Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. How gracious of God to not get into it with Peter, but just say, hey, don't worry about him. What I do with him is what I do with him. You follow me. And just repeats his command. What a cliffhanger here also. This couple of verses are sort of verses about in a moment. But this is the end of this interaction. The disciples go out fishing in the morning. Jesus tells them to cast their net on the other side. They catch a bunch of fish. They go, they have breakfast. There's this, I assume Peter, John, and Jesus walk off. There's this huge reconciliation with Peter. Jesus says, follow me. Peter says, well, what about this guy? Jesus says, don't worry about that. Follow me. And that's it. Curtain goes down. Screen goes blank. That's the end of the recorded story. How does Peter respond? What a cliffhanger for this to end on. What happened next? We can see in events in the Bible some of the things that happened later on. Follow him. But what a suspenseful ending. The question for you, the question for us is, what is our cliffhanger? Jesus has said, you follow me. And then the screen goes dark. Where is that in our lives? What has God said? You follow me. And we've said, well, what about this guy? We've turned around. We've done whatever. And Jesus says, no. You follow me. And we're there right now. What is that thing in your life? What is that thing in our lives where God has called us again to follow him, kept calling us to follow him? And what happens next in the story? We've talked about comparison. We've talked about trials. What is that for us? The final thing here is God calling us into community. So what is community? The body of Christ, the church. So 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and then some selected verses in that, starting in verse 12, ending in verse 28. For just as the body is one, members of the body, for in one spirit we were all baptized into one body, and all are made to drink of one spirit. We're not of one member, but of many. This is the church, that we are the body of Christ, many members, all different, all weird, all funky in our own ways, who are brought together with specific giftings God has given us. So that's community. And calling into community is two things, both obedience within community and obedience into community. So a caveat here. Obeying God's calling in your life always requires personal action. It can never be outsourced to the community. So we just talked about not relating to God through other people. If you're part of a church and the church is doing good things, that's not the same as you doing good things. So if the church is obeying God and you're not obeying God, you're still not obeying God, no matter if you're part of the church. Now that sparks a question, can you be obeying God and not be part of a church? I'm glad you asked. So God has called us into community. That's a whole sermon in itself. We're not going to go into it. But the first thing is community helps us keep a right view of God. Looking at the next verse, verse 23. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? If you were a believer in the first century, and you were not in a church community, you might never get this letter from John. And you might have heard through the rumor mill that John was never going to die. Because of part of the church being in community, you get input from other believers saying, actually, this is about this thing. Community, we help keep a right view of God. Second thing is community helps our faith. Higher vantage point on faith. If I am alone in my relationship with God, all I have to strengthen my faith is my relationship with God. If I am in a community of people in relationship with God, I have my experiences with God, I have Zach's, I have Becky's, I have Wayne's. There's this collection of stuff coming together where we have a higher vantage point. Verse 24, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things. and we know his testimony is true. Are you part of a community such that you know people? You know them following God, and you know that their testimony about God is true. And is your faith being grown by that? If not, that's part of being into that community where you are not only interacting directly with God, but you're with other people who are interacting directly with God, and you're learning from who God is. You know that their testimony is true. Finally, remembrance is communal and commanded. These are two pretty large verses in Joshua and Deuteronomy. I'm not going to go into them for time constraints, but Joshua 4, verses 4 through 9 is the story of the Ark of the Covenant being carried through the Jordan. The Jordan's a big river. You can't really carry a big box through a river, but God works a miracle and kind of allows them to walk through on dry land, a sort of Red Sea moment. And Joshua calls one representative from each of the tribes of Israel and says, okay, you're all going to build a big pile of rocks, of stones, to commemorate this. You're going to say, oh, this was because of the work that God did. It's a communal activity. God commands us to remember, and it's an event where the group, the whole tribe of Israel, is working together through representatives to build up this point of remembrance. And then in Deuteronomy, talking about teaching God's words to your children and responding to communal activity. So that is his passion for calling.